Well, hello and good morning, friends and faithful listeners, and thank you for tuning into the Bible Explained podcast on this lovely Monday morning. So we're going to get into 1 Chronicles chapter 23 today and discuss the Levites and how they are broken up into different divisions to do different jobs in the temple that is about to be built. And of course, how does all of this relate to today? Well, I hope you faithful listeners had a wonderful weekend. I actually entered the federal duck stamp competition this year, and the judging was on Thursday. And my painting did not make it to the second round. I did have one judge vote for it to move into the second round, but only one, and you need at least 3 judges to want it to move forward in order for it to actually move forward. So I was a little bit bummed out by that, but it was such a fun experience, both from the painting of the duck to the process of the judging. The entire experience was fantastic, and I have duck stamp fever. I am looking forward to entering next year's contest, and hopefully my painting gets through to the second round. We shall see. But of course, faithful listeners, tell me what you guys did over the weekend. I do love hearing from all of you. And of course, if you ever have a prayer request, do not hesitate to reach out. You're going to find my email listed in the description of this episode, and I will pray for you for the week. Let's go ahead and read 1 Chronicles 23 today, the entire chapter. And as usual, I will be reading from the WEB today, but feel free to grab the version of the Bible that you prefer. And if you can't read the Bible right at this minute because you're working or driving, then I always encourage you to go back when you can and read through it yourself because, I am a human being and I make mistakes. So please, I encourage you guys to always do that. And don't just take my words for it. Read it for yourself and let the Holy Spirit work through what you are reading. 1 Chronicles 23, the entire chapter. Let's jump right in together. Now David was old and full of days, and he made Solomon his son king over Israel. He gathered together all the princes of Israel with the priests and the Levites. The Levites were counted from 30 years old and upward, and their number by their polls, man by man, was 38,000. David said, "Of these, 24,000 were to oversee the work of Yahweh's house. 6,000 were officers and judges. 4,000 were doorkeepers, and 4,000 praised Yahweh with the instruments which I made for giving praise." David divided them into divisions according to the sons of Levi: Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. Of the Gershonites, Ladan and Shimei. The sons of Ladan, Jehiel the chief, Zatham, and Joel 3. The sons of Shimei, Shelemith, Haziel, and Haran 3. These were the heads of their fathers' houses of Ladan. The sons of Shimei, Jahath, Zena, Jeush, and Beriah. These 4 were the sons of Shimei. Jahath was the chief, and Ziza the second, but Jeush and Beriah didn't have many sons. Therefore they became a father's house in one reckoning. The sons of Kohath, Amram, Ezer, Hebron, and Uzziel, 4. The sons of Amram, Aaron and Moses, and Aaron was separated that he should sanctify the most holy things, he and his sons forever, to burn incense before Yahweh, to minister to him, and to bless in his name forever. But as for Moses the man of God, his sons were named among the tribe of Levi. The sons of Moses, Gershom and Eleazar. The sons of Gershom, Shebuel the chief. The son of Eleazar was Rehabiah the chief, and Eleazar had no other sons, but the sons of Rehabiah were very many. The son of Ezer, Shelemith the chief. The sons of Hebron, Jeriah the chief, Amariah the second, Jahaziel the third, and Jechamiam the fourth. The sons of Uzziel, Micah the chief, and Ishiah the second. The sons of Merari, Mali and Mushi. The sons of Mali, Eleazar and Kish. Eleazar died and had no sons, but daughters only, and their relatives, the sons of Kish, took them as wives. The sons of Mushi, Mali, Ader, and Jerimoth, 3. These were the sons of Levi after their fathers' houses, even the heads of the fathers' houses, of those who were counted individually, in the number of names by their polls, who did the work for the service of Yahweh's house, from 20 years old and upward. For David said, Yahweh, the God of Israel, has given rest to his people, and he dwells in Jerusalem forever. Also the Levites will no longer need to carry the tabernacle and all its vessels for its service. For by the last words of David, the sons of Levi were counted, from 20 years old and upward. For their duty was to wait on the sons of Aaron for the service of Yahweh's house, in the courts, in the rooms, and in the purifying of all holy things, even the work of the service of God's house. For the showbread also, and for the fine flour for a meal offering, whether of unleavened wafers, or that of which is baked in the pan, or of that which is soaked, and for all measurements of quantity and size, and to stand every morning to thank and praise Yahweh, and likewise in the evening, and to offer all burnt offerings to Yahweh on the Sabbaths, on the new moons, and on the feasts, in number according to the ordinance concerning them, continually before Yahweh, and that they should keep the duty of the tent of meeting, the duty of the holy place, and the duty of the sons of Aaron, their brothers, for the service of Yahweh's house. So in the last few chapters of 1 Chronicles, we are going to get into basically David's last commands for his people before he dies. And what's really interesting about this, it shows how dedicated David was to the temple, that the last things he's telling people to do is all related to the temple pretty much. So David's heart was definitely for God's temple. Like that is what he knew needed to succeed in order for Israel to succeed. David understood that if Israel was far away from God, that if they were not worshiping Yahweh, that Israel as a nation would fail. And that is why David dedicated so much time to making sure that the temple was special, that people would want to go there to worship Yahweh, that things would be done the proper way, that organization would be put in place so that people could effectively go and worship Yahweh at the temple. So I think that's what David's mindset was in his last days, that this is what needed to be done in order for Israel to succeed after him. So it says in verse 1 that David was old and full of days, and he made Solomon his son king over Israel. Now what's really funny is that the chronicler does not mention a single thing about the tumultuous way that Solomon got to the throne. Because David's kids were all kind of bad. Like they all were fighting with each other and trying to kill each other. You guys remember the famous story of Absalom, right? One of David's sons tried to kill David in order to get the throne. Well, that actually happened again in 1 Kings chapter 1. David's son Adonijah tried to become the next king, tried to usurp the throne in a very similar way, actually, that Absalom had done years prior to this. But Solomon was going to be the next king. That is who David dedicated the throne to. Mainly because God had actually told David that Solomon would be the son that would raise up the temple. And so I think David knew from God himself that Solomon was supposed to be the next king. But David's other son, Adonijah, obviously wanted the throne for himself. And you can read that story in 1 Kings chapter 1, verses 32 through 53, where Adonijah is just deciding that he's going to become the next king. And he starts like blowing these trumpets throughout all the city streets, while his father is still alive, by the way, telling people with all these heralds that he is the next king, that David has dedicated the throne to him. And that was not true. And ultimately, Adonijah did not win. Actually, he tried to usurp the throne twice, once before Solomon became the king when David was still alive, and once afterward, actually, after Solomon had already become the king and David had died. He tried to do it in a different way by marrying one of David's concubines, which would have given him some legitimacy to the throne. And Solomon, I believe at that point, ended up having him killed because he kept trying to take the throne away from Solomon. But the chronicler does not mention any of that, which is kind of funny, and instead just goes straight to the Levites. So that kind of shines a light a little bit on who the author of Chronicles was. Most people think it was the priest Ezra. And Ezra was really focusing in on the rules of the temple and on the building of the temple and who the Levites were, because Ezra knew that this was important going forward, especially since Ezra was writing this after the Babylonian exile when people were starting to come back to Israel. But going back to 1 Chronicles 23, verse 2, it says, after David had made Solomon his son king over Israel, it says he gathered together all the princes of Israel with priests and the Levites, which, by the way, David never gave up the throne really until after he died, but he dedicated the throne to Solomon, which is talked about in 1 Kings chapter 1. But after all this happens, and this tumultuous thing takes place, he gathered together all the princes of Israel with the priests and the Levites, And it says, the Levites were counted from 30 years old and upward, and their number by their polls, man by man, was 38,000. Now keep in mind right here that the Levites, it says, were counted. A few chapters back, we actually saw David go and count the people, and that was considered to be a very big sin. But this shows right here that there was certainly something more going on in David's heart rather than just counting the people, because we do see censuses taking place several times in Scripture. Actually, in Numbers chapter 4, God commanded Moses to take a census. So censuses in and of itself are not sins, because even David right here counts the Levites. He took a census of the Levites. That wasn't a sin. So we know a few chapters back when David counted the people, there was certainly something more going on than just taking a census, but we just don't know what that was. But anyway, David takes the census here of these priests. It says, the Levites were counted, in verse 3, from 30 years old and upward, and their number by their polls, man by man, was 38,000. So that's a lot of Levites, you guys might be thinking. 38,000 Levites. David said of these, 24,000 were to oversee the work of Yahweh's house, 6,000 were officers and judges, 4,000 were doorkeepers, and 4,000 praised Yahweh with the instruments which I made for giving praise. And you might be like, why in the world is David setting up all of these Levites, like thousands of Levites for each job, for just one temple? You know, how much work could possibly need done at this one temple? Well, very likely, these Levites were not working all at the same time. You know, I really highly doubt that 4,000 Levitical doorkeepers were standing next to the door of Yahweh's temple, like blocking the entrance to get in. They probably worked in shifts and took months off. I'm sure that this was very highly organized. And in fact, this is the first time in Israel's history that we really see this organization taking place, other than when God first instituted it way back in the wilderness. You know, God initially organized all of this, but then as the Israelites moved into the promised land, they never organized any of this. It was like the Wild West in Israel's history, especially during the time of the Judges. Like nothing of this nature was taking place. David was the first person to reinstitute this organization of the Levites. And he did this once again because he wanted God's temple to be a place where everyone could easily go to worship Yahweh. He understood the necessity of all of this. In verse 6, it says, David divided them into divisions according to the sons of Levi, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. And then in verses 7 through 21, it talks again about the families of the Gershonites, the Kohathites, and the Merarites. And I'm not going to go back over these three families, but I will remind you guys what each of these divisions are. So the Gershonite Levites were the Levites who oversaw the temple coverings. So this would include any tapestries. This included the ropes and the tents and all of the things, I suppose, that went into making the temple look beautiful. The Kohathite Levites were the only ones allowed to be priests. So no, not every single Levite was a priest, but every single priest at this time had to be a Levite. Now that all ended, of course, when Jesus came and became the first priest who was not a Levite, because Jesus was of the tribe of Judah. It says in the book of Hebrews that Jesus is now our high priest, no longer under the order of Moses and Aaron, but under the order of Melchizedek. Okay, and Melchizedek was talked about way back in the book of Genesis, and we will certainly get into who Melchizedek was when we move into the book of Hebrews. But Melchizedek was a very important priest back in the days of Abraham. In fact, he was Abraham's priest before the nation of Israel even was born. But up until the time of Jesus, every priest had to be a Levite, but not every Levite was a priest. Most of these Levites just made sure that the day-to-day operations of the temple were running smoothly. So the Gershonites could not be priests. The Kohathites could be, but the Kohathites, not all of them became priests, but they did have to oversee the temple furniture as well. So they maintained and took care of the altar, the stands, the implements, everything that was necessary for the functioning of the temple. And they were also supposed to oversee the Ark of the Covenant. But of course, that all changed. Now that there is a permanent temple in place, the furniture, like the Ark of the Covenant, is not going to be moving around anymore. So the Kohathites no longer had the responsibility of carrying the Ark of the Covenant after the temple was built. And then the last division of the Levites were called the Merarites. And the Merarites oversaw the construction of the temple. So they maintained the building structure itself. They made sure everything was to code, I guess. They would update things as things were breaking down. That was the job of the Merarites. So in a nutshell, the three divisions of the Levites were the Merarites, the Kohathites, and the Gershonites. The only people of those three divisions that could become priests were the Kohathite males, specifically from the lineage of Aaron, Moses' brother. So then, of course, in verses 7 through 23, it goes into those three divisions of the Levites a little bit more in depth. But like I said, I'm not going to go back over that again, because in the next chapter, actually, this is talked about once again. So you can see how the author really focused in on the tribe of Levi for a good reason, actually, and we will get into that a little bit more in depth in the next chapter. But jumping down to verse 24, it says that these were the sons of Levi after their fathers' houses, even the heads of their fathers' houses, of whom were counted individually in the number of names by their polls, who did the work for the service of Yahweh's house from 20 years old and upward. So what's really interesting about that is David had the Levites counted from 20 years old and upward. But earlier on in this chapter, in verse 3, it says the Levites were counted from 30 years old and upward. And that was according to the law. In Numbers chapter 4, verses 1 through 3, God himself specifically said that the Levites were supposed to work from 30 years old and upward. Yahweh spoke to Moses and to Aaron, saying, "Take a census of the sons of Kohath from among the sons of Levi, by their families, by their fathers' houses, from 30 years old and upward, even until 50 years old, all who enter into the service to do the work of the tent of meeting." So God himself instituted that Levites who were supposed to help in the temple were to be at least 30 years old. Now, later on in Numbers chapter 8, God did say that 25-year-olds could help as well. Numbers 8, starting in verse 23, Yahweh spoke to Moses saying, "This is what is assigned to the Levites. From 25 years old and upward, they shall go in to wait on the service in the work of the tent of meeting. And from the age of 50 years, they shall retire from doing the work and shall serve no more, but shall assist their brothers in the tent of meeting to perform the duty and shall perform no service. This is how you shall have the Levites do their duties." So God specifically put an age limit in place. A Levite who wanted to help in the temple had to be at least 25 years old, and they could be no older than 50 years old. But David, in 1 Chronicles 23, just kind of ignores the age limit. And it says that he counted the people from 20 years old and upward. And no one has any clue as to why David did this. Because in a sense, David was kind of breaking the Old Testament law that God put in place. There's a lot of speculation. It could be that David made the age limit for Levites a little bit younger, because that was also the age where a young man could join the military, and so David wanted it even across the board. It could be that David thought that younger men were more necessary for the work of the temple. Maybe he just wanted like young guns in there who were able to do physical work. Could also be that he thought that more people were necessary in order for the functioning of the temple to go smoothly. He just wanted more manpower. But it is kind of bizarre that David ignored the age limit that God himself put in place in the book of Numbers. And no one knows why he did that. But in verse 25, David does explain why he's putting all this organization in place. Here's what it says. "For David said, Yahweh, the God of Israel, has given rest to his people, and he dwells in Jerusalem forever." Also, the Levites will no longer need to carry the tabernacle and all of its vessels for its service. For by the last words of David, the sons of Levi were counted from 20 years old and upward. David explains, he's like, the reason I'm putting this organization into place is because God now has chosen Jerusalem as his home, and he is going to stay here forever, which we know is not really the case because, the people sinned, and so God did not live in Jerusalem forever. But I do believe God did choose Jerusalem because Jerusalem to this day is a very special place. We know that there is something very, very holy and special about it because Christians, Muslims, and Jews all want their piece of Jerusalem. So something is very special about Jerusalem, and we all understand that. But God was not going to dwell in a place where sin was running rampant, which unfortunately took place only a couple generations after David died. In fact, by the time of the Babylonian exile, the temple had gotten so bad that there was like prostitution happening in it, where people could go into the temple, rent a prostitute, and have like ritualistic sex with that prostitute inside of Yahweh's temple. All of this was taking place. And in fact, God actually told his prophet Ezekiel, he said, look at what they are doing inside of my temple. It is disgusting. And he showed Ezekiel what was going on, like all of these hidden rooms where the priests would go in to like worship other gods and do like weird rituals to these other gods inside of the temple to Yahweh. And they were doing it kind of secretly, and God opened that up to the public. He showed through Ezekiel what these priests were doing inside of his temple. So God was not going to live in a corrupt temple. But regardless, David knew that Jerusalem was special, and that's why he's building the temple in Jerusalem. And so he says, the Levites will no longer need to carry the tabernacle and all of its vessels for service. Back in the wilderness, we know that the Levites, one of their jobs was to carry all of the tabernacle furniture and the tabernacle itself, actually, because the tabernacle is just a big tent. That was one of their jobs. But now that there is a temple being built, David says the Levites' job is going to be different now. So we have to put a new structure in place, different organization, different roles for these Levites to do. And that is why David is organizing this all ahead of time. And then it lays out what the new duties of the Levites were going to be. For their duty was to wait on the sons of Aaron, in other words, the Kohathite priests, for the service of Yahweh's house, in the courts, in the rooms, and in the purifying of all the holy things, even the work of the service of God's house, for the showbread also, for the fine flour for a meal offering, whether of unleavened wafers, or that which is baked in the pan, or that which is soaked, and for all the measurements of quantity and size, and to stand every morning and thank and praise Yahweh, and likewise in the evenings, and to offer burnt offerings to Yahweh on the Sabbaths, on the new moons, and on the feasts, in number according to the ordinance concerning them, continually before Yahweh, that they should keep the duty of the tent of meeting, the duty of the holy place, the duty of the sons of Aaron, their brothers, for the service of Yahweh's house. I love that the last verse there is very unifying for the Levites, even though they are assisting the sons of Aaron, meaning the priests. That doesn't mean that they're not doing important responsibilities. All of these jobs were very important for the functioning of the temple. Even though they were not positions in the spotlight, they probably were thankless positions at many times, cleaning the courts, making the showbread. These were not jobs that were in the spotlight like the priest had. But yet they were such important jobs for making sure that the temple ran effectively. Yes, the priests had an important job as well, which was teaching the law to the people, offering sacrifices, offering prayers, taking care of the spiritual health of the people visiting the temple. But the jobs in the background were also so important. The gatekeepers would keep watch over the temple to make sure that nobody nefarious was coming in. They were kind of like the security detail. The musicians would offer praises to God and encourage the people to worship through prayer and through psalms and hymns and whatever else. There were Levites who were craftsmen who would make sure that, things were up to date and looking pretty in God's house. There were Levites who probably just went in and cleaned and swept and took care of the little details that nobody would think about to make sure that God's house just looked beautiful all the time. And that's how it is with the church as well. There are jobs that nobody is going to notice, but they are jobs that are so important. I went to a ministry meeting at my church yesterday, and the one thing that I was really impressed with was the fact that there was so much organization behind the scenes taking place that I didn't even realize was going on behind the scenes. Nobody sees those positions, but yet they are so important for the functioning of the church. And I encourage all of you faithful listeners, if you are looking for something to do at your church, maybe do one of those positions that doesn't seem like it gets a lot of thanks, or it kind of seems sort of innocuous. Maybe step into one of those positions, because I can guarantee that people are needed for those positions. But I can also guarantee that you might actually have a very enjoyable time filling that role. A lot of times when I am the happiest serving, it's when I'm doing things behind the scenes. I just really like doing those types of roles because you get to know more people in the church. You kind of get to form a team with them. So if you're looking for a role to step into in your church, maybe start in one of those smaller roles, like greeting people when they walk through the door, or serving coffee, or doing the soundboard, or being part of the security team or the medical team if your church has that, or even being part of the cleaning detail, or whatever other capacity your church might have for you to step in and serve. You might find you very much enjoy those roles, and when you're in it, I think you're going to see how important those jobs actually are. And for those of you who already are doing those types of jobs in your church, I commend you, because you're not getting the spotlight all the time. You're not getting thanks all the time, and yet you're showing up and you're doing these positions that are just so needed for the functioning of your church. Keep at it, and when people don't thank you, just know that God sees you and that God is going to reward you for that work. Faithful listeners, I've just been getting some of the nicest comments and reviews on the podcast. And on occasion, I like to read those comments because I want to thank you guys. So the two comments I'd like to read today are from Spotify. The first one was from Mike Spicer, and he wrote, "I have sifted through countless biblical podcasts, and this one by Jen is the best. Keep up the great work." Well, thank you, Mike. I do appreciate that very greatly. I'm glad that the Bible Explained struck a chord with you. Very, very happy to hear that. And then I also have a comment here from Varen Muchesa, I believe that's how you pronounce it, who is from Zimbabwe. And Varen says, "Hi there. Thank you so much for taking your time to record these podcasts. Do not lose heart and keep on keeping on. These podcasts are really helping me on my daily devotional, and I always look forward to them every morning." Thank you, Varen, for that encouragement. Not gonna lie, sometimes I do lose heart when doing this podcast, especially when things don't work out. I actually got a new interface for my mic just recently because my old one was getting old. And I'm like, all right, it's time to update to a new one. And of course, it didn't work. So halfway through this podcast, when I was recording it, the podcast just stopped recording. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I hate when things just don't work. Just let them work the way I expect them to work. Well, I just needed to update my drivers. That was it. It was a very, very easy fix. And I certainly did not need to have as much irritation and discouragement over it that I did. Lesson hopefully learned for next time. So yes, I do appreciate the encouragement of all of these very nice comments that I get. All right, faithful listeners, I will see you guys tomorrow. We are going to be in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, talking more about that fascinating book. And of course, we will be getting into the discussions of Jesus returning, because that is what 1 Thessalonians focuses on very deeply. So I hope to see you guys tomorrow, 6 a.m. or whenever you choose to wake up and listen. But until tomorrow, happy listening and God bless.